Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name is Brian Powers, and I'm the Executive Director for the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI. And I'm glad you've joined us this evening as we welcome Dr. Richard LaFleur from the University of West Georgia to join us in conversation and present on moral injury as world disruption, narrative identity, phenomenology, and the crisis of mattering. I want to say just a few brief words about the International Center for Moral Injury, which is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. Lastly, let me just note that all conversations on moral injury may invoke intense reactions within us. We'll be discussing narratives of moral injury, perhaps that are sometimes direct, as well as different definitions and concepts. Please exercise self-care and stepping away if you need to, and know that there is help available if you feel overwhelmed. Jane's posted the link below to lifeline-international.com in the Q&A box. Please explore that link if you feel overwhelmed and know that help is available near you. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Richard LaFleur is Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of West Georgia. His research interests are in the intersections of phenomenology, narrative inquiry, and veteran reintegration research. He's published widely on moral injury, spirituality, and mattering, along with providing workshops for organizations fostering positive mental health and well-being. I enjoyed getting to know Richard at our conference this year and at an adjacent retreat in April, and I'm excited to welcome him to this webinar. So Richard, I'm honored now to turn things over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jane, and your entire team for setting this up. It's truly an honor to be here with you. So let me begin by just saying this is sort of a general overview of what we will be talking about today. And one of the things I will be doing is also situating my philosophy, my pedagogy behind this book, Moral Injury and the American Veteran, Looking for Meaning Through Trauma, Shame, and Guilt. So this sort of is the underpinning of my thinking about moral injury and how I situate it as part of my scholarship. So let me open by asking this question: what does it mean to have a moral life? And this question seems to be situated at the heart of understanding moral injury and the impact it has on the human condition. So I offer this as a response based on the work of W.R. Sorley and The Moral Life, where he says the conduct of man is distinguished from behavior of animals and the presence of moral ideas. These ideas appear in a way that he regards conduct and character in which issues in conduct, some are approved by him, and we call those good. Others are disapproved, and they're called bad. When we talk about the origins of moral ideas, we can trace their connection with the physical and social development from their earliest to our present, based on the work of Sorley. So I think it's safe to say that we can reflect on what may constitute a good life and how the ideas of a good life have varied throughout time and throughout our development. However, when we enter the space, whether the life is called good was really good or not, this is no longer a historical question, but one of validity and worth related to the life being described. This moves the question from the historical perspective. And for Sorley, he calls this the life of the moralist. And I'm not here to say that we are all moralists. However, in order to fully understand the depth of this good life or a moral life or morality, the moralist is there to provide an account of the characteristics of human life which are good or praiseworthy and which are commonly described by the term, and we use this term quite often, virtue. So for many years, Moral conduct and codes, they have been in place. They have been affected by ideas and judgments of men where concepts and constructs such as race and age, they they condemn what has been approved by the other that fits the idea of values and worth. Sawley writes, there is nothing just or unjust, and he's quoting Pascal here, the scientist, which change does not always change in quality or the change of the climate. And he says that 3 degrees of latitude sometimes is enough to overturn all of science. And I love this because what he's saying to us here is that law is not always absolute. And usually when we think about morality, we have to think about customs and traditions because morality can also be shaped by context. And the relativity of justice, is it legal or is it a moral code? And by referencing Pascal's work, it also shows the instability and the variability of human law. So, as I think about morality and sort of where it's situated within us as human beings, it tells me that there's this contrast between the changing of the human laws, the ideas of what are and what should be, as well as there are deeper truths to these meanings. So, for the most part, the qualities most admired are those that are the circumstances of the people. And Sorley goes on to say, where war is common business, we talk about courage. And when we talk about courage, bravery in battle is one of the valued traits from a war-based society. When we talk about a settled or stable society, we're looking at fair rules and stability, and justice becomes the most important part of this harmony for trust. And when we look at the industrialized society, people tend to rely on trust and transactions and cooperation. So honesty and reliability. These are what are praised. But in the quote, he also says that there are those who do not practice or praise them, meaning society values. These traits are sometimes, they are not always adhered to by other individuals because we are human. And over time, we tend to have moments where we either mess up or we have mistakes. So when we look at morality and we look at the context and we look at these traditions that sometimes we judge them by, it's important to understand that throughout our human history and our development, these codes, they have changed over time. But then he talks about what's called vices. And here, sorely, he quotes Macaulay, Lord Macaulay from 1828. And he says, every age and every nation has certain characteristic vibes, which prevail almost universally, which scarcely any person scruples to avow, and even rigid moralists but faintly censor. Succeedingly, generations change the fashions of their morals and the fashions of their hats and their coaches and take some other kind of wickedness under their patronage and wonder at the depravity of their ancestors. So every society, we accept things that are immoral behaviors as normal. And I think we can look around the globe today and we can see where what might be considered an immoral act, and it's now normalized and part of what is just considered normal behavior. So societies tend to normalize these wrongdoings over time. And then we have this notion of judging the past, judging generations from before. And for me, that sort of raises the idea of maybe it's a little bit of a hypocrisy here because we see the flaws of others and sometimes we tend to ignore the flaws of our own. So, with that being said, I think we can safely say morality is a human factor, and men are never without some moral consciousness as a distinction between good and evil, between the things that are to be done and the things that are avoided. Um, and as I sort of open this space up to go a little bit deeper, I wanted to share this quote with you by Mr. Horwitz, who was an anthropologist, and he shared this story about the challenges of looking at moral injury and morality. Mr. Howes once said to a young Australian native who was speaking about food prohibited during initiation, "But if you were hungry and you caught a female opossum, you might eat if the old men were not there." The youth replied, "I could not do that. It would not be right." And he could not give no other reason than it would be wrong to disregard the customs of his people. Now, this story has nothing to do with morality in the civilized mind, but to the savage or to the deviant, it becomes problematic. For the youth, the customs of his people was his measure of right or wrong. It may be safe to say that in earlier civilizations, customs and morality were one and the same. The customs of a tribe that may have been connected to an individual's conscience and was the regulating feature of conduct and behavior. Rules and laws did not exist outside of these customs and traditions. There were no defined punishments for disobedience, but a breach of traditions and customs was met with severe consequences and even death. Individuals were not granted the opportunity to self reflect. The tribal stage of society, men showed little independence of character. They were social or tribal to the core. They thought in herds, and they followed the tradition of the tribe as their rule of right or wrong. And even more thought-provoking is the difference that have existed between moral codes and different communities and societies. So as I think about this, responses such as cruelty, intemperance, cowardness, untruthfulness, disregard of human life, they have all been practiced at one time or another by people without remorse and sometimes without rebuke. These things exist always, everywhere, by all men. And while these are part of the human existence, they're only part of the narrative of morality. We can conclude that vices may be acquiesced in without being held to the virtues. The coward may still admire bravery, the liar truth, the intemperate man self-restraint, although he condones his own lack of the virtue. So, with this in mind, early morality seems to be tribal morality. And to understand moral attitude of the members of the tribe, we must look to conduct how they conducted themselves between man and man within the tribe and not their behavior towards strangers. So as I lay this foundation and I thought about this as I was putting this textbook together, this book together, I know we can look at Kohlberg and sort of how we bring morality on board and how we distinguish what's right or wrong, but I thought it was important to sort of situate this in early civilization as well. So let me sort of summarize my thoughts here as we think about the introspective way of thinking about morality. Because with the example of the Australian native, even though his idea of right or wrong was connected to the tribe, to the tradition, there was still an internal process that was going on. Dr. Westermark says it this way. When we examine the moral rules of uncivilized races, we find that they, in a very large measure, resemble those prevalent nations of culture. In every savage community, homicide is prohibited by custom, and so is theft. Savages also regard charity as duty and praise generosity as virtue. Indeed, their customs concerning mutual aid are more often stringent than our own. And many uncivilized peoples are conspicuous of their aversion to telling lies. But at the same time, there is a considerable difference between the regard for life, for property, truth, and general well-being of a neighbor, which displays itself in the primitive rules of morality, that which is found among ourselves. The primitive identification of morality with tribal customs and the progression of moral ideas depends on their liberation from the rules of customs. While this may seem liberating, the application of morals over time And the ideas may become more universally adapted. In some cases, even more obscured meanings. Instead of adherence to customs by consequence, it concentrates attention upon actions rather than upon character, upon external manifestations of life rather than upon inward nature. This emancipation from the external factors related to customs increases individual reflective factors of morality. So I'd like to make a statement here. Morality is internal. It belongs to the inner life. And Sorley writes it this way: there is an inner circle of personal life which a man claims as his own, and into which neither positive law nor social rule is able to penetrate. It rests upon consciousness of difference between good and evil. This consciousness influences the springs of action in a man's own nature. It works from within, outwards, and is capable of affecting every part of his life. So now we're making this move into understanding, although these external factors with the tribe, with early civilization was important, there is still an internal process that happens that brings us to how we define morality. So I'm going to make a turn to phenomenology here. And within phenomenology, the movement was developed by Edmund Husserl at the turn of the 20th century. And it was largely as a reaction against the twin threats of psychologism. Here we see Husserl's rallying cry to the things themselves. It was a call to philosophy to abandon metaphysical speculation and return to the rigorous description of the phenomena of experience as they are given to consciousness. So the cornerstone of Husserl's method and his way of thinking was intentionality. And this was a concept he borrowed from his teacher, Franz Brentano. For Husserl, intentionality, the defining characteristic of consciousness, all consciousness is conscious of something. We do not merely have isolated sensations. We perceive a tree. We remember a childhood event. We fear a threat or desire an object. Consciousness is always directed, always reaching beyond itself towards a world that it constitutes as meaningful. Now, this was a radical departure from the Cartesian tradition. And a crucial development in Husserl's later thought, particularly in the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology, was the concept of the life world. He came to realize that the transcendental ego of his earlier work was already situated in the pre-given, intuitively experienced world. The life world is the horizon of all of our experiences, the background of the familiar, the unquestioned meanings, practices, traditions that make our specific intentional acts possible. It is the world of common sense, of everyday life, which the objective sciences presupposed, but then forgot to bring back into question in their quest for the mythical idealization. So the task of phenomenology then became one of rediscovering and describing this primordial world which all meaning springs. As he argued, objective truth is related throughout the world, the life world. This concept would become the bridge from a transcendental phenomenology of consciousness to the existential and hermeneutic phenomenologies that followed, which placed our historical and cultural situatedness at the forefront. Now, while Husserl's project remained focused on the structures of transcendental consciousness, his assistant Martin Heidegger executed a dramatic and decisive shift in being and time. Heidegger argued that the primary question for philosophy is the question of being. He criticized the Western philosophical traditions for having forgotten this question, conflating being with beings, the particular entities that are. Husserl's focus on consciousness for Heidegger was still a form of this forgetfulness, as it took a specific kind of being as its foundation. So Heidegger's fundamental move was to analyze the kind of being for whom being is an issue, which is Dasein, a German word for being there, that he used to refer to the human existence. Dasein is not the subject confronting an object world, but it is essentially being in the world. This is a unitary phenomenon. The in is not the spatial in of one subject contained in another, like water in a glass. Rather, it denotes Dasein's involvement in dwelling, its preoccupation with the world. The world correspondingly is not a collection of present at hand objects, but a referential totality of equipment, purposes, and social roles, a meaningful context of involvements. So Heidegger's analysis of Dasein and everydayness reveals its primary mode of engagement to be one of care. And we encounter the world not as disinterested spectators, but as a workshop of tools. So a hammer is not perceived as an object with certain properties for weight or shape. It is encountered in its usefulness for driving nails. It's referenced to the project of building a shelter. It's only when the hammer breaks that it becomes present at hand, an obtrusive object and of theoretical contemplation. This analysis fundamentally challenged the primacy of the theoretical knowledge, arguing that practical, pre-reflective engagement is the foundation of all human existence. And furthermore, Dasein is always being with others. Social existence is not an add-on or a pre-existing subject. It is a constitutive feature of Dasein. We are always already immersed in a public world, the they, which provides with interpreted meanings and norms. This situatedness in tradition and language is what Heidegger calls thrownness. We find ourselves already in a world not of our own making. Yet, Dasein is also a projection, oriented towards its own possibilities, most fundamentally the possibility of its own death. Authentic existence involves resolutely taking up one's own being towards death, freeing oneself from the idle talk and curiosity of the they, and owning one's finite historical situation. So for Heidegger, it's about finding one's place in the world. Now, if Heidegger grounded phenomenology in the world, then Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his seminal work Phenomenology of Perception, grounded it in the body. Merleau-Ponty's work is the culmination of the existential turn in phenomenology and provides the most direct and powerful framework for connecting philosophical inquiry into culture and social life. Merleau-Ponty launched a sustained critique of what he called objective thought and intellectualism. Objective thought, characteristics of the natural sciences, treats the world as a collection of determinate objects in causal relations. Intellectualism, found in certain rationalist philosophies, reduces perception and experience to the operations of constituting consciousness. Both, according to Merleau-Ponty, miss the ambiguous pre-objective realm of the lived experience, the body as we live it before we think about it. His central thesis is the primacy of perception. Perception is not the result of intellectual synthesis or the processing of sensory data. It is our original pre-predicative contact with the world. The perceived world is always presupposed foundation of all rationality, all value, and all existence. This perception is inherently embodied. The body is not an object in the world for me, like a table or a corpse. It is my point of view on the world, my vehicle for being in the world. And he distinguishes between the objective, the corpor, the body as biological, physiological entity, and the lived body, the body as I experience it, as the locus of my habits, my skills, my perceptual powers. The concept of the body schema is crucial here. It is not a conscious representation or image of the body, but a pre-personal dynamic system of motor capacities and perceptual skills that integrates our body into its environment. If it is the body schema that allows a skilled typist to type without looking at the keys, or a football player to navigate the field without calculating distances. It is our body's understanding of the world, an understanding that is practical, not intellectual. So for Merleau-Ponty, he says it this way: consciousness is in the first place not a matter of I think that, but of I can. This embodied perception is also fundamentally intersubjective. The perception of other people is not a problematic inference for their behavior to a hidden mind, as it is in the classical problems of other minds. From infancy, we perceive the gestures, the expressions, the actions of others, the directly expressive of another conscious. We see anger in the clenched fists, joy in laughter. This is because we share a common corporal structure and a common world. My body and the other's body are two sides of a single reversible fabric of existence. This notion of reversibility is later developed in his unfinished work, The Visible and the Invisible, through the concept of the flesh. The flesh is not a matter of mind, but an element of being, a kind of general thing that is both seer and seen, toucher and touched. My hand touching an object can always be touched by my other hand. My vision is part of my visible world it surveys. This chiasmatic structure, this intertwining, is the foundation of our communion with others and of the world. So, as you see, when we think about moral injury, it is not just an injury. We experience and treat a byproduct of the experience. Moral injury is the experience when certain traumatic events happens in our lives. While moral injury has emerged as an important area of interdisciplinary research across philosophy, psychology, theology, military studies, healthcare, and many other disciplines, the concept generally refers to the profound psychological, spiritual, and existential distress that may result from participating in or witnessing of. For this, I'd like to turn to the work of Primo Levi, who provides a very important philosophical and moral framework for understanding the complexity of moral injury. Levy's reflections on survival and shame and witness and moral ambiguity illuminate the existential dimensions and the catastrophic moral experience. In The Drowned and the Saved, Levy introduces the concept of the gray zone to describe morally ambiguous conditions in which traditional distinctions between victim and perpetrator become destabilized under systems of violence or coercion. Levy's work challenges the simplistic moral binaries and highlights the institutional systems that may compromise agency, identity, and ethical clarity. This framework is important for moral injury research. Many morally injured persons struggle not with clear categories of innocence or guilt, but with ambiguity, compromised agency, institutional betrayal, and survival within morally fractured systems. Healthcare professionals making triage decisions, soldiers operating under the impossible conditions, chaplains working within institutional constraints may experience moral injury precisely because inherited ethical frameworks fail to adequately contain the complexity of the lived experience. Levy's reflections on shame are equally significant. Survivors may experience shame not because they committed wrongdoing, but because they endured morally catastrophic worlds. Such shame reflects contamination by proximity to violence, degradation, betrayal, and dehumanization. So, this insight resonates deeply within moral injury, where individuals frequently report existential contamination, estrangement from selfhood, and difficulty reclaiming moral identity. Levy also illuminates the limits of language. Catastrophic experience often resists narration. Witnesses become fragmented. Memory becomes morally unbearable. Moral injury therefore persists not only because of traumatic recall, but because language itself struggles to restore coherence to a shattered world of morality. And with that, I'm going to make a very sharp turn here into the concept of mattering. And I hope you're still with me. Mattering, an important yet underdeveloped dimension of moral injury. Much of the existing literature emphasizes guilt and shame and betrayal, but pays less attention to the existential significance, disposability, and institutional non-recognition. Mattering refers to the experience of being significant, of valued and recognized within relational and communal worlds. Moral injury frequently involves profound disruptions of mattering. Individuals may feel discarded, expendable, invisible, and morally abandoned by institutions, communities, or even systems. So, the crisis of mattering is particularly evident in military healthcare, just to name a few, and institutional contexts where individuals may perceive themselves as replaceable or morally expendable. Such experiences deepen existential suffering by undermining one's self of value and belonging. The morally injured person may experience not only guilt or shame, but also the collapse of significance itself. From a phenomenological perspective, the crisis of mattering further destabilizes worldhood. If persons no longer experience themselves as morally significant within shared worlds, then relational belonging and future possibility become increasingly difficult to sustain. Moral injury thus becomes simultaneously ethical, existential, relational, and narrative in character. Self-reflections such as "I no longer matter" or "what I sacrificed meant nothing" and "I became replaceable" become the dominant ideology and narrative, and direct reflection of identity. So what does this mean for narrative identity? Narrative identity refers to the individual's way to organize lived experience into coherent understanding of selfhood across time. Human beings do not simply accumulate experiences, they interpret them within narratives that connect past, present, and future. Paul Ricoeur's concept of narrative identity proposes that personal identity is not fixed or stable, or a stable essence, but is instead formed through stories individuals construct about their lives. Rather than understanding the self as something static, Ricoeur argues that identity emerges through the ongoing process of interpretation, in which past experiences, present actions, and future aspirations are woven into a coherent narrative. Central to this idea is the distinction between idem sameness, which refers to the continuity in traits and characteristics, and ipsi selfhood, which reflects agency, responsibility, and the capacity for change. Narrative identity mediates between these, allowing the person to remain recognizable, the same, while also evolving over time. Through the process of implantment, individuals organize life events into meaningful sequences, transforming chronological occurrences into unified stories that gives shape to human existence. This narrative process is inherently temporal and ethical, and it situates the self within commitments, responsibilities, and relationships, making identity both accountable and reversible. Ultimately, for Ricoeur, the self is never complete, but remains open to reinterpretation, continually reshaping through the dynamic of storytelling. So these narratives provide continuity, coherence, and moral orientation. Through narrative identity, persons construct meaning, sustain belonging, and imagine future possibilities. Moral injury frequently disrupts this process. And for me, this is what I call the narrative disruption. The disruption may produce profound existential fragmentation in which prior understandings of identity become unstable. Narrative disruption involves more than a painful memory. It includes the inability to situate morally catastrophic experiences within a coherent account of the self. The morally injured persons struggle with questions such as, who am I now? What kind of person did this make me? Or how do I continue living after what I witnessed or participated in? Such questions reveal not simple emotional distress, but fractures in the narrative of continuity of the self. So, moral injury and narrative disruption can be closely understood through Ricoeur's framework of narrative identity, as both involve a breakdown in coherence of the self story that gives life meaning. Moral injury occurs when individuals perpetrate, witness, or fail to prevent actions that violate deeply held moral beliefs, resulting in guilt, shame, and a fractured sense of self. So, from a narrative perspective, such experiences disrupt the process of implantment, the ability to integrate events into meaningful, continuous life story, thereby destabilizing both idem, sense of continuity, and ipsi, sense of ethical agency. The individual may struggle to reconcile who I have been or what I have done, leading to the narrative rupture which previously held values, beliefs, commitments no longer align with the lived experience. This disruption creates a form of existential disorientation where the individual's story loses coherence, moral direction, and future orientation. Healing from moral injury, therefore, involves a process of narrative repair or the reauthoring, in which a person is able to reinterpret the event, restore a sense of agency, and reestablish a narrative that can once again sustain meaning. Importantly, narrative disruption involves temporality. Moral injury often alters one's relationship to time. The past becomes intrusive, the present becomes unstable, and the future difficult to imagine. Moral injury persists not only because the event is remembered, but because future directed meaning becomes compromised. This temporal fracture may result in what can be described as moral lateness, the continuing existential weight of morally injurious experience long after the event has happened. So, as I sort of make a turn now to get us towards the end of my presentation, because I know we're almost at our time here, let me mention just a little bit about intergenerational trauma. Moral injury may extend beyond the individual through intergenerational transmission. If moral injury disrupts narrative identity and moral worldhood, then unresolved moral suffering may shape familial, communal, and institutional narratives across generations. Intergenerational trauma research has demonstrated that silence, unresolved grief, shame, and emotional fragmentation may be transmitted relationally through families and communities. However, moral injury introduces an additional dimension: inherited moral atmosphere. This concept refers to the implicit existential environment shaped by unresolved moral suffering, betrayal, silence, and ethical fragmentation. Children and communities may inherit not only traumatic memory, but also moral disorientation, distrust, silence, and fractured relational worlds. Institutional betrayal may shape collective identities across generations. Historical violence, systemic injustice, war, racism, communal abandonment may continue to influence moral imagination long after the original event has passed. So, this framework suggests that moral injury may not simply be the wound of the individual, but it may also alter the actual atmosphere. So, my closing thoughts: it revolves around this central theme that within moral injury, we have the process where it fractures narrative continuity. It alters the lived experience. It destabilizes moral identity. It disrupts temporality. It collapses the sense of mattering, and it extends through inherited moral atmosphere. These are a few of my references. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. There's was so wonderful and rich in connecting so many of those concepts. So I so appreciate that deep philosophical dive there and bringing up the roots of how we get to that concept of mattering so much. That's really helpful to me. I think, and there's so many ways in which we can talk about this easily, and then take certain things for granted about how we view them. I think it's helpful just to root that in in that philosophical discourse, from specifically kind of clinging to so many different things that I'll kind of pivot to in a moment, but that sense of existentialism is focusing on the way in which we are in the world and the way in which we perceive the world through those experiences. I mean, it's really valuable, I think, just in terms of how you know, especially well, so as we think about AI being such a valuable way to describe things. And I was thinking about this, just a silly analogy in terms of, you know, we recently got a couple of these Ring doorbells, and with that comes a certain amount of days where it will have an AI description of what's happening. And it's always kind of hilarious sometimes, as somebody's walking up your porch with this, and you're like, "What? No, that's not what's happening." But I think, as you talk about measuring descriptions of things versus, so much of existentialism roots us to the idea, for example, that I think you brought a football pitch analogy at some point, that you can measure what's happening, and an AI could describe the way a player is moving on the pitch and what's happening and scoring a goal, perhaps. But that doesn't get at all the feeling of doing that and what it means for people and all those aspects of how we lived that event. And I think that's so important for moral injury and paying attention to that from the lived experience of it. And so in that way, I think it just philosophically roots such good research in the idea that it's still listening and lifting up those lived experiences. Sorry, I'm editorializing massively on what you said, but it's wonderfully helpful. It's a great to think about that. There's so many things. I've got so many great notes of just little threads to come back to. One thing, even early, just in laying the groundwork, I was going to ask about. I think it was Macaulay you were talking about, noting things like how we can value things even if we're not practicing them, and that idea of the liar might value truth, I think, was one of the examples you used. To me, that strikes me as so vital, just even in itself, and thinking about moral injury, because I wonder if one of the causes of it we often think about in those kind of terms is I don't I feel like I know what's right, but not having lived into that, I value that so much after my own experience. And if that isn't a source of a positive description of kind of how shame works
Mhm.
in that sense of not being able to be the thing that I know I should be or that I really actually value, and that and thinking about it that way. Do you think that resonates well with that kind of?
Yeah, yeah, that definitely resonates. One of the things that I've come to understand, and as a phenomenological researcher and really diving into the lived experience, we have these ways of being. We have these truths that are already in us. We don't necessarily have to search for them. They're there. We all grew up, we have these histories, these different contexts that allows us to be who we are. And then we are faced with these instances, these circumstances that calls it into question. And it creates the tension within me because I know what I'm supposed to do. I know that I should tell the truth. I know that I don't have to lie. But there's this other part of me that justifies it. And even after I do the thing, I commit the act, I'm still left with the remnant of what I
Mm,
know is right. And I think for a lot of people in conversations with them, sometimes that becomes the part that they cannot reconcile. I know what is right, and then I begin to beat myself down for making the decision of doing the wrong thing. Not that I did the wrong thing, it's the decision that I made to do the wrong thing. And that
mm,
becomes sort of the hang up for them. And I think that's sort of what he was saying in that example, as a football player. Well, yeah, you can stop and measure the distance, but the experience, after you've done it so many times, you can feel it, you can sense it, you know it. There is
mhm.
a knowing. And that's why I love Husserl's work because it brings us back to describing the experience, the lived experience in the lived world.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think that's so powerful for this. Um, I'll bounce a couple more things off because I think there's a lot of really fascinating connections there. But let me just take this as a reminder to folks to, I'll turn in a few minutes just to your questions. So if you have them, please do utilize that Q&A box now. Think about those, put them there, and then I'll get those into the conversation with Richard in a few moments. Um, yeah, but just to connect to, I think that you've brought in Primo Levi there towards the latter part and talking about moral injury and essentially kind of a confusion, right? That moral injury creates this confused state where we're not entirely sure of how we navigate back to this, almost in contrast to what we were just talking about, where there's kind of a moral certainty that I know I've done this or I've made a decision, and I may not understand that entirely. But also, moral injury is getting wrapped up in a confused part of I thought this was doing something good and in a positive way. Um, and I know it occurred to me here that one of the things I've said recently to chaplains sometimes is the encouragement that people who experience moral injury, there's something paradoxical here because they kind of want you to hold that idea, a firm moral stance that they may be describing something they've done. They actually want you to kind of give a clarity that might be an act that is generally even universally wrong, but with compassion towards them and finding a way to process the fact that we all do those kinds of things at the same time. Does that make sense in that same?
Yeah,
What do you think?
because
There's a lot of fascinating interactions there.
yeah, of course, I gave a very brief overview of Primo Levi's work in the Drown and the Save, and he, especially when we get into the gray zone, because everything becomes ambiguous, and now you wrestle between the perpetrator and the victim, and in those moments, as you were talking about that tension that it creates, that's part of the destabilization that happens. So it's not simply either I did something or I experienced something or I saw something. It becomes so complex, and the work with Primo Levi, especially when you look at he when he interviewed a lot of the guards that went on to live after the Holocaust. They thought they were doing this good thing, but We can go to the Stanford prison experiment as well. People thought they were doing a good thing
Mm,
by doing an experiment to learn about human behavior, but it lacked agency, identity, ethical clarity. It became so confusing that it itself became ambiguous. And this ambiguous way of living, especially after acts like moral injury, it creates a complete wreck for a person's life. So not only is that person under the stress or the inability to reconcile themselves, even within the system, because now it's a fracture of the system that they are a part of, whether it is their view of the system that they're in or the way the system has treated them, it becomes so fractured that they can no longer find their place in the world.
mm. And that's such a good analogy because I mean, the thing that I continue to take away from like the Stanford prison experiment, which is darkly fascinating if,
Hmm.
if you're not familiar with that, but Stanley Zimbardo, who essentially sets out to do this experiment, gets pulled deeply into the bizarreness of it. I mean, I have mixed feelings about how Zimbardo is aware of himself in
Right.
some places in here, but in some sense, there is kind of a meta commentary in this about about how we, even as researchers or people trying to describe a phenomenology, also have to be intensely aware of how we can easily get pulled into different patterns
Yeah.
and roles and how those deeply influence the way we do that even.
Yeah, and in the first chapter of the book Moral Injury and the American Veteran, I dedicated that chapter to the relationship between the researcher and the participant because we're not just doing this work to extract data. It's a correlation. We're co-constructing something, but there's an ethic we have to follow. And even the way we position ourselves in research in itself is very important. So I took that first chapter to sort of lay that foundation because for me, and for those of you that you do this work of moral injury, it is deeply personal. It touches the core of who we are. And when you start to engage in these stories and these actions and these struggles that people go through, that relationship, because remember, I said as well, especially inside of the concept of mattering, it breaks down what it means to matter, which becomes a breakdown in relationality as well. So,
Mm. No, I think that, and to bring that to mattering, there's a connection I made when you were talking about that, and it's such a wonderful way to describe it. I mean, I think that you were using terms, was it significant, feeling like we are significant both in our own lives and in the world and the
mhm.
context around us. I think that's such a really, on a personal level, I think it's a really meaningful and necessary way to talk about this because I think that hits so close to ways that certainly I've experienced, and I think so many others have as well. Um, it's also there's an interesting note. I think that I'm not sure if you've encountered this, but there was a King's College London. Um, some of their Center for Military Health Research did a paper came out of there a few years ago. It might have been 2022 or 2023. But they were connecting, moral injury and vulnerability to radicalization.
Mm,
And I thought it was something interesting to look at. One of the things they mentioned was very closely connected to this, but the idea of offering what extremist groups offer, they contended was, a way to be significant. Now it
mhm.
simplifies and narrows moral horizons, but
Yeah.
one of the ways they would recruit is to obviously say to disaffected people who feel insignificant and they don't matter, their agency doesn't matter in the world. It offers them a path back to, and offers them a narrative as well. When you're talking
Mhm.
about narrative disruption, that
Mhm.
very much situates at the heart of it your own mattering.
Yeah.
You feel like you don't matter. Here is a way to intensely and by often violently
Mhm.
matter in the world. And there's the moral ambiguity, even of what they're being asked to do sometimes falls away in light of the selling point being how significant you can become. I just think it's just a fascinating way in which the way you've laid that out connects to the importance of that
Mhm. Mhm.
and highlights that so well. So it's
Yeah, I
not a
mean
good
that.
question there, just to say
No,
that
no, no, no,
it's
no. But
wonderfully connective way to talk about it.
yeah, it's a great point because William James says one of the most difficult things a person can experience is being in a room with a door and being in a room as though the door is closed and no one sees or recognizes you. When we're in a position where we don't feel like we matter, where we are invisible, which is what we call anti-mattering, that
Mm,
takes us to what we call those dark spaces. That's where those questions. So think about the person who has experienced moral injury and they are now in a space of anti-mattering and they're asking the questions, well, what I did is what's not even important. I'm replaceable. Like who am I now? When I can't find my sense of self, when my core self has been completely obliterated and I can no longer find meaning and purpose. And then you have a movement that says, hey, by the way, we can give you back that significance where you feel like you're
mm,
important again, and you can do something that makes a difference. That is so fundamental to who we are as human beings to matter. I could also take this to the beginning, the story of Adam and Eve. That whole story, that I love that for shame. But in that moment inside of shame, notice they felt as though they no longer mattered and they hid themselves. They went into
mm,
isolation, right? So they hid
mm,
themselves from God, and He had to go and find them to let them know, no, I still love you. You might have messed up, but I still love you, right? So that
mm.
idea of mattering it is such a crucial piece, especially with moral injury.
Yeah. Boy, no, thank you. I could talk about this for a long time. Let me just say briefly, thank you for this wonderful conversation and really illuminating presentation.